Welcome to episode 62 of the GT on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel SoC. Let's get started. My first topic this week is Rakuten, and they had several announcements that we're going to get into, but the first was its intent to acquire Open RAN player Altiostar. And my question is it a smart move? So on the surface, this is a $1 billion acquisition. And obviously it's going to give Rakuten, Open RAN capabilities. But I'm curious if this is the right way to spend dollars, given many other, operators around the globe are simply leveraging and licensing solutions from infrastructure providers. I mean, it's no secret that, spectrum costs are ballooning, and just the infrastructure costs, both hardware and software, are ballooning as well. I really question whether this is a good investment for them, and also it makes me wonder, will this limit Altiostar's marketability with other operators as well, knowing after it closes that Rakuten will own them. So what are your thoughts?
I think you're right in asking that question, but in my mind, the business strategy behind it makes sense in that if they plan on building out many networks for many operators, or at least being the provider of choice through their Symphony division, which they created as well this week.
Yeah.
This might be a vehicle for them to save money as they continue to add customers to their list and justify the cost. That said, I think they do need to go out and acquire enough business to justify the $1 billion cost, because they will have to justify it with, at least $1 billion worth of business.
Yeah. And it also makes me wonder, there's been no secret that they've had integration challenges. I mean, they've been the poster child for deploying, a cloud native, highly virtualized network, and they have had integration issues. And so by acquiring Altiostar, maybe that, over time eliminates some of those integration issues because the co-development might be more tightly defined. But you're absolutely right. I mean, they're going to have to generate a ton of business, to really justify that price tag. You mentioned Symphony. They had an analyst, call this week. I believe you attended. I couldn't make it based on the timing, but there's also, when you talk about the network build out, are you referring to the one-in-one 5G network that they referenced this week?
Well, I think that's one of them.
Okay.
But the one-in-one deal that they've signed, they didn't give details on, in terms of financials. So we don't know how much of an impact that'll have on the new Symphony division's financials.
Right.
But I have a feeling that because they already have a pretty, this will be Germany's 4th operator, that this would very likely be a big reason for them to have gone out and acquired Altiostar, because it will be an Open RAN deployment. And if they're going to go nationwide, that'll probably pay for a good chunk of their $1 billion investment in Altiostar. But they're going to need more customers to justify this expense. So I think you're right in asking that question. But at the same time, there might be some integration challenges that they could overcome by integrating a player like Altiostar.
Yeah, and I'll make a final point too, and I've mentioned this on prior podcasts. I mean, Open RAN is cost optimized, not performance optimized. So, it's not one size fits all from my perspective. There are going to be certain, workloads that are going to require a more performance optimized radio access network, but time will tell. We'll keep our eyes and ears open on this one and report back as things develop. But let's move to your first topic this week. You want to talk about T-Mobile and some 5G use cases around VR and XR. And I think you wrote an article on Forbes, right, about this?
Yeah, so it hasn't published yet, unfortunately.
Okay.
But basically what's going on is T-Mobile is actually, they're not doing like proof of concepts anymore. They're not talking about use cases. they're actually launching them. So this is something that I think it's a big deal because a lot of operators have talked about, robotics and XR, VR as use cases for 5G, right? But we've only seen pilots and we've seen, tests and things like that. But these
Yeah.
are actually commercial deployments of VR and robotics in the real world with real companies that are using it today. So the first company is Sarcos Robotics, which is actually a local company here, and they are doing some really interesting stuff because they have lots of these like robots that work in factories. And I believe the robot that they paired with T-Mobile's 5G network is going to allow them to remotely operate equipment and do things because a lot of the Sarcos robots are either exoskeletons or have human-like capabilities with their robot arms. So initially it would be for viewing, so like someone can remotely view what the robot's doing. But then eventually, as they start to roll this out next year, they will actually be able to remotely control the robots as well. And that will all be on T-Mobile's 5G network. And that 5G equipment will be, or 5G capabilities will be built into the robot. So it's not like they're just, bolting something on. This is from the ground up. And if I remember correctly, I think Sarcos Robotics was one of the companies that was in T-Mobile's labs. So I think this is a really good example of these labs working for T-Mobile and helping them onboard new industrial customers. And then the other one is with a historically Black university called Fisk University. And they are leveraging VR for a cadaver lab for students. And what they're doing is they're implementing 5G because they needed it, not because this is a 5G use case, but because 4G and Wi-Fi simply didn't have enough bandwidth and weren't low enough latency for what they needed to be able to allow 20 students to use a cadaver lab all at the same time. And the reason why it's an actual good use case is because cadavers are very expensive. They cost thousands of dollars and they're pretty much a one-use kind of situation. So by having a virtual cadaver lab, you can include more students and you can save money on cadavers, and you can allow students who are not even in the classroom necessarily to potentially experience that. That said, this current deployment of this VR 5G use case is interesting because it's going to use a 5G hotspot to connect to T-Mobile's ultra wideband network. It's not a millimeter wave application, and it's not a special deployment of T-Mobile's network. It's using commercial T-Mobile network in Nashville, which is where Fisk University is located. And they're just going to use this hotspot for the time being until 5G starts to get into VR headsets. But I foresee this being used in the future where each student has a 5G enabled headset with a modem inside of it, and they could technically take this class or do this cadaver lab anywhere and not have to be in the room at the same place. So it's very interesting. Lots of very compelling use cases. These don't no longer sound pie in the sky, which I've been criticizing most carriers for in the past because they talk about it, but they don't do it, and now they're doing it. And T-Mobile just banged out 2 this week.
Yeah, you're right. Lots of proof of concept, labs, across Verizon, AT&T and T-Mobile, and I've spent time, with all of those carriers in their labs. And what I'm impressed with T-Mobile, we talked about on a prior podcast, this remote vehicle, piloting use case in Las Vegas that is in production, and now these VR XR use cases that are in production. So T-Mobile continues to extend its 5G leadership beyond just things like standalone and that sort of thing, and deploying out low band and mid band spectrum, but also in use cases as well. So and I expect Verizon and AT&T will come along in good time, but I continue to be impressed with T-Mobile's achievements there. Let's move to my second topic this week, and I want to talk about Huawei. And there was news this week that the embattled Chinese infrastructure provider is investing upwards of $100 million in the Asia Pacific region on incubating startups. And so what, it wasn't really quite stated in the press release or any of the articles that I read online, but could this be a diversification strategy on the heels of its recent earnings dip? And so the company did report about a 30% reduction in overall top line revenue, although profitability was pretty stable. Obviously, that's coming out of their service provider business, with 5G deployment and that sort of thing. They report that their consumer business is somewhat down just based on the entity listing and shortages in semiconductor and that sort of thing. But that their enterprise networking group continues to grow, but it was a relatively small part of the company, relatively speaking, only representing about less than 10% of the overall revenue, but they see that as a growing opportunity. So, I do view this as a potential diversification strategy. I'm not aware if they're taking equity positions in these startups as they fund them, but certainly this allows Huawei to stay in the game. And they also commented that even given the block in a lot of markets within the service provider community, that they're continuing to attend events or continuing to promote their capabilities, and with a focus on helping companies with their digital transformation journey. So what are your thoughts?
I find that money talks. So when you go out and invest in companies, you have some influence over them. And you also have some influence over what technologies get funded. So I think it's important to understand that there are some benefits to Huawei being an investor, and investing in the right technologies, because ultimately being a VC is something that a lot of American companies already do today. And a lot of them do it to facilitate their own needs. So I could see Huawei wanting to invest in a lot of chip startups, right?
Yeah.
To facilitate APAC-based chip production, or maybe it's something around some other, antenna technology. So
Sure.
I think there's a lot of opportunities for Huawei there, and lots of other companies do it today. So I think it makes sense for them to maybe focus on APAC, because there's probably a lot less restrictions on APAC companies compared to US companies. So
Yeah.
I think that's probably kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point that, I don't know what the profile is and the investment that they're making from a kind of a company perspective, but I imagine there's some semiconductor in the mix there, to your point. So excellent insight there, buddy. Let's move to your second topic this week. And I did catch the news that Google's launching sort of a premium line of their Pixel phone, but they also announced a new system on chip, right, as they're moving away from Qualcomm. And you wanted to talk about that this week.
Yeah, so on Monday, Google kind of came out and announced that they would be launching the new Pixel 6 later this fall, which is usually what they do, but they kind of gave a technical preview in the sense that they are acknowledging the rumors that Google will be building its own SoC called the Tensor chip. It's an SoC. We don't really know much about the details of the SoC other than it's AI focused, which is within Google's realm of expertise. But what's interesting is there was no talk about 5G at all, even though we know that most of Google's Pixels are 5G enabled. So that's a very interesting thing that they chose not to talk about. And we don't know who's going to make this chip for them, and we don't know what modem it'll have. And those rumors have kind of swirled around the fact that it might be a Samsung-based solution, and that Samsung might be fabbing it for them and giving them the modem technology, because it's unlikely that they would ditch a Qualcomm SoC and keep the modem. They could go MediaTek, but if they go Samsung, they would also be able to, very easily fab that at Samsung. And it's possible, according to some rumors, that they are even just customizing an existing Exynos chip. So it's likely that we'll see this chip in the it's for sure we'll see it in the next Pixel.
Yeah.
But it'll be very interesting to see what kind of AI performance it'll have and how its 5G capabilities will stack up to the competition, as most competitive the solutions use Qualcomm modems, including Apple. So we'll see what happens there. But it was a big deal for a lot of the industry. And we'll see kind of how that shakes out this fall when they launch the new Pixel 6 and Pixel 6 Pro.
I find it interesting that, you know, they sort of put it out there and they didn't really provide a lot of details, right? So maybe this is the marketing team's, you know, sort of rolling thunder approach to kind of like what, you know, what the market's appetite, and then follow that up with details whenever they do, you know, officially launch, you know, these new devices. But it'll be interesting to kind of keep our eyes on it. So let's move to my third and final topic this week. And I had the opportunity to speak with the OnGo Alliance. This is formerly the CBRS Alliance. And they are responsible for driving the ecosystem around CBRS, that 3.5 gigahertz, you know, spectrum block. And it had been several months since I spoke with Dave Wright. You know, he's the lead there. He recently left CommScope and his day job to join HPE. So we congratulate Dave on that. He's still finding his way around after a couple of months. But we had a great conversation. We talked about, you know, sort of all of the emerging use cases. No surprise, you know, the majority, 50% plus, are sort of factory automation, you know, type solutions tied to private networking. He gave me an update. They have almost 200 members now. They've added 3 new master communication providers. So these are like the Federateds of the world, that are helping sort of broker things and you know, and provision solutions and that sort of thing. Interestingly, Nokia has become one of the new of the 8 there, and that's no surprise given their focus on private networking. We've talked about Nokia on prior podcasts as well. But it seems like, you know, he was telling me the ecosystem is really maturing. They've gotten through all of the major hurdles. And now that they're past, you know, sort of these major milestones, they're even creating opportunities for secondary market. So we talked also about the types of companies that purchased, you know, spectrum. These are 10-year licenses, and it gives these folks the ability, if they're not using, you know, if they buy spectrum for a certain geographic area and it's not going to be used in a certain part, that can be, you know, released. And so they're allowing, with guidelines, these 8, you know, sort of major, what they call master service providers, to kind of manage the secondary market. So it seems like it's shooting on all cylinders. One of the reasons why they rebranded from CBRS Alliance to OnGo was that they're also helping facilitate the model that's been successful in the US on a global basis. And it's no secret that, countries like Germany and Europe and other parts of the world are sort of getting ahead of, this type of scenario, and, trying to figure out, sort of how to manage the spectrum without all of the bureaucracy that's associated with having to manage it through a governmental entity. So all in all, it was a great conversation. I mean, I don't know if you have any insight there or if you follow the OnGo Alliance, but I thought I'd ask your opinion.
I do not follow OnGo remotely as closely as you do.
Yeah.
However, I did see that Federated is deploying some CBRS spectrum in commercial 5G applications already.
Mhm.
And things are moving along quickly. So this does sound like a very promising opportunity for private 5G enterprises to have a very unique industrial specific version of 5G that doesn't necessarily cost remotely as much in terms of spectrum as something else would nationwide or with a bigger swath of spectrum. So it'll be very interesting to see how this pans out over time.
Yeah, for sure. And absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. CBRS is OnGo is definitely optimized for, for private networking deployment, so I've always stated that, I really believe that they've done a tremendous amount of good in democratizing access to licensed spectrum. When you look at some of the profiles of the entities that purchase spectrum, it's all over. It's all over. You've got school districts, you have healthcare system providers, you have just a number of very unique different types of entities that have never had access to licensed spectrum. So it's definitely very powerful, and as things develop, we'll report back. But let's move to your third and final topic this week, and you want to get sort of an update internationally on 5G deployment.
Yeah, so this international update is focused on APAC, specifically the two biggest and most I don't know, leading 5G deployments. So the Chinese government has an entity that kind of gives updates on what's going on in China in terms of 5G, and they have announced that the Chinese operators have deployed 961,000 5G base stations.
Wow.
And that there are 365 million 5G connected devices in China, which are both staggering numbers. The 360 million number is quite large, and according to the Chinese government, represents 80% of all global 5G connections, which clearly puts China in the lead in terms of 5G deployments. But that said, China also does have 1.6 billion mobile users. So they are only at 22.8% of penetration in terms of 5G users versus the entire install base, which actually matches South Korea's new 16.48 million 5G subscribers, which is 23%. So interestingly enough, both Korea and China are roughly at the same 5G penetration rate, which is pretty good when you consider that we are 2 years in and we're almost at 25% penetration. So it's very promising, and I expect things to continue to ramp, especially as Verizon and AT&T roll out their C-band and T-Mobile continues to roll out their C-band. I would expect that the US will not be far behind next year.
I would agree with that statement. I mean, we talked about AT&T on a prior podcast, and what was that number again? They claim that they have reached, was it 150 million subscribers, or was it 250?
Oh, they're pops. Yeah, so the pops, I think they're 250 million pops, and T-Mobile's at 300. So that's obviously not customers, but that's potential customers. So we'll see how that pans out with C-band. I think there will be a lot more opportunity to get more people to transition.
I agree. And I'm not surprised to see South Korea up there as well, right? We've talked about how they've been a real leader in deploying 5G, and SK Telecom in particular impresses me with use case deployment as well, just like T-Mobile that we spoke about earlier. But hey, buddy, another great podcast. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insight on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Will Town Tech, and I'm at Anshel SoC. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.